How do you paint a flower? In this video, we're going to look at a very loose watercolor sketch of a flower. It's a bee balm, which is a type of flower, but we're going to look at a sketch and a painting of a bee balm with a little bee on it. So first things first, I have a very loose sketch around this painting. It basically has the general shape of the flower, a couple of the details, a few of the details of the bee, but past that, there's not many details. And there's pros and cons to this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's one way to paint something. It's a way to paint really loosely. And as you can see when I start here, I'm really just doing a wet on wet wash. It's mainly a bunch of different pinks and purples all blended together, but I don't have a huge direction as to where those colors are going. And you can see it's just sort of blending all together. So I'm also painting some of the leaves, and there are different colors within those leaves. It's not just straight green like you might picture a leaf in your head. So one exercise that you can work on when you're doing this kind of painting is not just painting what you expect, not just painting a green leaf like you might expect a leaf to be, but actually looking at your reference photo and understanding what colors are actually present in the thing that you're painting. So for example, the leaves here are a little bit of green, yeah, but there's also purple and pink and yellow, and later on you'll see little spots from where maybe like a little bug has been chewing on it or something like that. So you can't just paint one color and expect it to have a realistic result. One good way to do that is by having a first wash that has some vibrancy to it, some different colors, because that'll just carry through the rest of your painting as you keep going. So I've got basically a first wash done here. You can see I'm starting to put a little bit more detail and a little bit more texture around some of the flower. And one of the challenges here with not having a really defined sketch is that on this left side of the flower, I don't exactly know what I'm painting here. I know that there's some general shapes. I have the reference photo on the right. I know that there's some shadowed areas. I know there's some areas in highlight, so I'm trying to mimic that the best I can, but I haven't really defined that in my sketch, so it's making a little bit like I don't exactly know what I'm painting, but I'm going to just kind of wing it. And that's fine if you're interested in doing that kind of thing. I don't often do that, so this is a little bit of an exercise for me to paint something without planning every detail out. Now, for some things like the bee, which I think I'll start painting in a second here, I do need to have a few more details because I want it to be at least recognizable as a bee, but I haven't really sketched out every single thing. On the left side, for example, though, I've got areas that at this point when I was painting it, I'm not sure I really knew exactly what I was painting. I just liked the general texture. I liked the different colors that were showing up, so I kept going with it. I've also added little hints of orange, which is I don't know the phrase for it. Someone can comment below what the phrase for it is, but the little orange part of the flower, so it adds a nice little pop of color behind it. And now I'm moving on to the bee. So you'll notice I've got the yellow parts laid down and the black part. I'm letting it blend and bleed together a little bit. It's a little bit stylistic. You can choose to let it bleed. You can choose to let it dry and then paint over it. The way it is, it's bleeding a little bit, but not a ton, so I'm kind of okay with it. Most of this first layer is all like wet on wet. I'm not letting stuff dry too much. I'm keeping the paint pretty wet while I'm going about and painting. So here I'm adding some shadows. I'm starting to add some shadows into the leaves and some things that I wasn't able to define in the first pass. So this is where you can really start to add some of the vibrancy to the painting. So you'll see that bottom right leaf, I'm adding some yellows to really make that color pop. On that stem, I've got this nice gradient going from like a greenish yellow to a orangey red at the bottom, and I'm adding more paint to help that pop. And as I go back into the main flower area, I'm trying to make sure that I maintain some separation between the shadowed areas and the really highlighted areas. So I've got a nice general gradient from left to right of sort of like a purplish color to a pink color on the right side. And I know generally, because of the way that the light is coming in, that it's going to be more highlighted on the right side and more shadowed on the left side. So I'm trying to keep that in mind as I go. When I get to the bee, so these wings that I'm doing here, I'm letting them dry because I don't want this part to bleed. These are the little, I don't know, filaments within the bee's wing. I want these to be defined. So I want the painting to dry before I put those on so they don't bleed around. But otherwise, most of this is pretty wet on wet. Even here, it's another good example. I've moved past maybe the wet on wet stage at this point, and some of this is starting to be a little bit more detail and texture oriented. So the shadows that I'm adding into the flower, I know that like if you look at the reference photo in the center, there's a lot of the shadows from the flower parts coming towards the center, and you get these shadows on the interior of the flower. So what I'm trying to do with the shadow there is sort of brush out from the center little bits of shadow. So it creates this sort of illusion of some parts of the flower coming towards you and some are in the light, but then deep within the flower there's quite a bit of shadow. So now moving on, I'm getting happier with the way that some of these shadows are working out. I still think there's probably some more depth that I can put in here. So I'm going in with another layer into really the shadowed areas, some of the parts I haven't really defined super well. And that's one thing that can be a struggle, is knowing like when is the right time to stop painting and when should you just keep going. And there's never really a clear answer. I think in general, I tend to just find a spot where I feel good about it. There are times where you go too far and do too much and you kind of ruin the piece, and it happens. It's okay. But for here, I've noticed that there's a lack of contrast in some places. And so I really want to darken up some of the areas and lighten up or make sure I keep some other areas lighter. On the right side, obviously, I've got those highlights still, and I'm trying to make sure those highlights are popping. So I'm using little bits of color and depth beneath the highlights that I can blend in. So if you look at the right side of the flower, yes, there's highlights on the top, but often on the bottom side of that flower, there's like a little shadow. So I'm using that little shadow to help really define what the highlight is. So when you think about it, the highlight is really only dependent on what the shadow looks like next to it. So that's one way to think about it. I'm getting close to finishing up here. I'm not sure exactly how much is left. Just a couple minutes left. So I'm adding some finishing details. So this is the bee's wing. I was adding a little bit of yellow to it, and that's like a really, really light wash. I've really diluted down the paint. And, you know, I'm not adding a background in this, so in some ways, some of the color that I'm adding to the bee's wings, for example, doesn't really make sense because technically that's reflecting maybe parts of the background or something like that. But I think it's a useful and like interesting color to put in there. So I'm adding it in a really light way, but that's something to think about, especially when you take something out of context. You have to think about the light that's reflecting on it. For example, if this bee was next to like a red flower, I would probably have a red reflection of light on the bee's wings. So it's one thing to think about what the colors are like when you just stare at the reference, but also think about why the colors are there. And is there something you're not seeing maybe that's causing that color to appear that way? If you take it out of context, is it still going to make sense? So it's another thing to think about. I'm getting really close here, just adding some of the darker shadows, and this is just a mixture probably of like a dark blue and dark brown. Again, you can use these complementary colors, opposite ends of the color wheel, to create your really dark colors. So the leaves, for example, they're going to be green, so I'm going to be using a green, a bluish color, and I'm going to contrast it with a red or a brown color to make a really deep black-ish hue that I'm going to put where the shadows are. So I feel like I'm just about at the limit here. I've got about a minute left. I'm probably just putting a few more details around the leaves, around the bee. But if you find these full-length tutorials useful or helpful, feel free and push the subscribe button. I'm thinking these are kind of easier videos to do. This painting itself, I probably took about an hour-ish on it. So it's sometimes hard to edit all those down. So if you find these interesting, it's pretty easy to do these like live reactions and commentary over them. So feel free to like the video, share it, comment. If you're interested in me doing something else, leave it in the comment and I'll take a stab at it. So anyway, I appreciate you all tuning in, and I will see you next time. Thanks.